What does it mean to discover something that was never meant to be found? Throughout history, exploration has carried a quiet promise. We imagine the map filling in, the unknown becoming known, the darkness giving way to understanding. But there is another side to that promise, one less often spoken aloud. A shadowed edge where curiosity brushes against silence, where answers once glimpsed seem to demand a price. This story begins not in one place, but across many. In jungles dense with breath and decay, in deserts where stone remembers more than people do, in ice fields that preserve secrets beneath centuries of snow, again and again across decades and continents the pattern repeats. An explorer ventures outward, they send word back, not of danger, but of discovery, something unexpected, something significant. And then, abruptly, they vanish. No bodies, no clear endings, often no evidence at all. We are taught to think of exploration as heroic, even triumphant. The lone figure against the vastness of nature. The scientist, the archaeologist, the wanderer pushing beyond the known world. But these disappearances complicate that narrative. They suggest that some frontiers do not yield easily. That knowledge itself can be fragile, temporary, or even self-erasing. The final messages are what linger. A letter describing ancient symbols carved into stone. A radio transmission interrupted mid-sentence. A journal entry filled with excitement, confidence, and certainty. The words are rarely fearful. More often they are hopeful, almost joyful, as if the explorers believed they were standing at the threshold of understanding. Then silence. In many cases, search parties followed. Governments investigated. Families waited. Decades passed. Official explanations were offered. Accidents, exposure, animal attacks, human error. And yet, something about these stories resists closure. Not because they are supernatural, or sinister, or forbidden, but because they are incomplete. What happens to knowledge when its witness disappears? When a person vanishes, we mourn them. But when they vanish, carrying a discovery, something else is lost as well. Context, meaning, proof. The fragile bridge between experience and shared understanding collapses. What remains are fragments. A camp left standing, equipment untouched, a camera missing, a notebook gone. The evidence seems to withdraw alongside the person. This is not a story about hidden conspiracies or secret powers. It is a story about limits, about how human curiosity moves faster than human certainty, about how exploration by its nature often outpaces explanation. Some of these explorers were professionals, trained and cautious. Others were artists, thinkers, wanderers driven by intuition rather than institutions. They did not set out to disappear. They set out to see, to document, to understand. And in that effort they stepped into places where maps ended and assumptions failed. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not that they vanished, but that what they found vanished with them. Across cultures and eras, we tell ourselves that the world is slowly becoming known, that mystery is shrinking, that there are fewer blank spaces left. And yet, these stories suggest otherwise. They hint that some truths do not announce themselves clearly, that some discoveries are fleeting, visible only for a moment, only to one person, before retreating back into obscurity. As we begin this journey, we will follow 10 such paths. 10 moments when discovery seemed close enough to touch. Each chapter will open where certainty ended, at the edge of a jungle trail, inside a canyon, beneath ice, within stone. We will not claim answers where none exist. We will listen, instead, to the words left behind, to the spaces between facts, to the human impulse that drives us toward the unknown, even when the cost is unclear. And we will ask, quietly and without judgment, a question that echoes through all of these stories. If discovery changes us, what happens when the discovery changes the world, but the discoverer never returns. It began with a map and a name, Z. In 1925, Colonel Percy Fawcett stood at the edge of the Amazon jungle, not as a soldier, but as a seeker. He was 57 years old, seasoned by war, tempered by years spent charting rivers and mountains no European had dared to cross. But this journey was different. This time, Fawcett wasn't following orders. He was chasing a belief. He called it Zed, a city lost to time, buried beneath the jungle's endless green. Not myth, he insisted, but memory. A place built by an ancient, advanced civilization long before the modern world took shape. He had seen the signs, stories told by indigenous tribes, strange ruins, cryptic manuscripts from 18th century Portuguese explorers. Stone by stone, word by word, the image had taken shape. On April 20th, 1925, Fawcett, his son Jack, and Jack's friend Raleigh Raimel left the town of Cuiabá in Brazil, slipping into the jungle with minimal supplies and deliberate secrecy. Fawcett believed a small party would move faster, draw less attention, and build trust with native peoples. He sent regular dispatches back to his wife, Nina. The tone was light, even joyful. They were finding traces, artifacts, stories, paths overgrown, but still remembered. Then came the final message, sent from the territory of the Kalapalo tribe on May 29th. The city is close. I can feel it. The Indians speak of ruins to the east. We head there tomorrow. That was the last anyone heard from them. In the decades that followed, more than 13 expeditions set out to find Fawcett. Over 100 people died in the attempt. What they found were conflicting accounts. The Kalapalo remembered the men heading east. Some tribes whispered darker stories. None agreed on what happened. Bones were presented, examined, and rejected. The jungle had taken them, but the mystery deepened. Satellite images, captured long after Fawcett's time, began to show something unexpected in the region he'd identified. Geometric patterns in the earth, ditches, roads, remnants of what may once have been cities. These weren't random formations. They suggested planning, architecture, civilization. Exactly what Fawcett had believed existed beneath the canopy. Modern archaeologists began to reconsider. The old narrative that the Amazon was too poor in nutrients to support complex societies started to crack. Evidence of pre-Columbian urban centers emerged. Terra Preta, a dark, fertile soil, showed that the land had once been enriched, cultivated, transformed. It seemed Fawcett had been right. And yet his story is unfinished. No journal recovered, no camera, no bones. Just that last sentence, frozen in time like an echo. The city is close. I can feel it. Did they reach it? Did they witness something never meant to be seen? Or did they simply vanish in a landscape that resists human memory? The jungle forgets easily. Trees grow over ruins. Vines seal paths. Even time loses its way beneath that green veil. But memory, human memory, refuses to let go. We return to Fawcett's story not because of how it ends, but because of what it represents. The moment before the threshold. The step into the unknown. The belief, stubborn and sincere, that something magnificent waited just beyond the map's edge. If he had returned, perhaps we would see the Amazon differently. Not as an empty frontier, but as a place where the past breathes under the roots. But he didn't. And so, his discovery remains unconfirmed, his truth unspoken. All that remains is a single direction, east, and a question, soft as a whisper beneath the trees. What lies buried that we are not yet ready to find? The desert speaks, but only to those who learn to listen. In the autumn of 1934, a 20-year-old artist named Everett Ruess disappeared into the canyonlands of southern Utah. He left behind no body, no journal, no footprints, only whispers of what he may have found. Ruess wasn't an ordinary explorer. Born in Los Angeles, he was a poet, painter, and solitary wanderer. While most his age were chasing careers or family legacies, Ruess was chasing something quieter, older, a feeling that the desert held secrets worth understanding. He called the wilderness his cathedral. He carved out months at a time to live among its cliffs and mesas, guided only by instinct, art, and the pull of ancient silence. In early November, Ruess passed through Escalante, Utah, where he was last seen. He was traveling with 2 burros loaded with supplies, sketchbooks, and watercolors. He stopped at a local ranch, speaking animatedly of what he had recently discovered. He mentioned ruins, not just crumbling walls, but messages, patterns, symbols. He believed the ancients had left more than relics. They had left knowledge. Then came the final letter to his brother. "I have been discovering so much. The ancients here left more than ruins. They left messages. I'm following the symbols to something remarkable." He signed it, unusually, as Nemo, Latin for nobody. Weeks later, a search party traced his route into Davis Gulch. There, they found his camp. His burros were corralled, alive but abandoned. His bedroll lay neatly placed, cooking supplies arranged. But Everett was gone. The word Nemo was etched into the soft rock near the site, as if he had deliberately named the moment of his disappearance. No one ever found a trail beyond that point. No further camps, no discarded supplies, no sign of a struggle, just a perfect stillness. Years later, remains were found and briefly thought to be his, but DNA testing ruled them out. The mystery remained untouched. What did Everett Ruess see in those cliffs? Some believe he succumbed to the harshness of the land, a fall, dehydration, an animal attack. Others believe he chose to vanish, folding himself into the desert like a final stanza in a poem. But the detail that remains most haunting is the calmness of the scene. No panic, no flight. Just a man who seemed to have walked away with intention. And without returning, Everett wrote that he was following symbols. He believed the ancestral Puebloans had encoded meaning in stone, and he was trying to decipher it. Not in a scholarly way, but through intuition, through presence. To him, discovery wasn't about conquest, it was about resonance, finding that one moment where the land speaks and you understand. He signed his final letter, Nemo, as if shedding his identity before crossing a threshold. Not lost, but changed. Not vanished, but absorbed into something greater than himself. Perhaps the question isn't what happened to him, but why he felt the need to go at all. In a world obsessed with answers, Everett Ruess chased questions. And in doing so, he became one, a question carved in stone, still echoing in canyon winds. What does it mean to disappear willingly in pursuit of something beyond language? And if the desert holds messages older than memory, who will be the next to listen and never return? November 1961. The swamps of New Guinea breathed steam and silence. Michael Rockefeller was 23 years old, the son of New York's governor and heir to one of the most powerful families in America. But prestige wasn't his currency. He had crossed oceans not for politics, but for passion, an obsession with tribal art, culture, and the untouched edges of the world. His destination was the Asmat people, isolated, proud, and steeped in ritual. They lived in a landscape of mangrove rivers and dark forest, a place where the border between myth and memory had never been drawn. Michael wrote home often. His journals were full of wonder, careful observations, sketches of canoes, carvings, dances. But in mid-November, the tone shifted. "I've gained their trust," he wrote. "Tomorrow they're taking me to see the sacred house, the place where they keep the objects no outsider has ever seen. This will be the find of a lifetime." 2 days later, on November 19th, his boat capsized. His companion, a Dutch anthropologist, was rescued. Michael swam for shore, 2 fuel cans strapped to his arms for flotation, and disappeared. The official report, said he drowned, but the river was calm, and Michael was a strong swimmer. Whispers grew that he made it to shore, that he was killed by the very people he had studied, that he had taken something sacred, crossed an invisible boundary, and paid the price. Decades later, new testimony emerged. Locals claimed he reached the village, that he had something with him, objects too valuable, too forbidden, pieces from the sacred house he had longed to see. If true, it changes the entire story. Michael Rockefeller may not have been the victim of misfortune, but of consequence. A boundary was crossed, trust was tested, and in a culture where memory is carried not in books but in bone and ceremony, such violations have meaning. Still, no body was found. No camera, no journal. Just silence. The Asmat believed spirits live in the carved forms of their ancestors, that the sacred house is not merely a museum, but a bridge between worlds. Michael may have entered that house. He may have seen and touched what he should not have. It is possible, too, that he understood the risk, that he wanted to see it anyway. That discovery, even at the edge of understanding, was worth the cost. But what lingers most is the image of a young man standing at the river's edge. Journal in one hand, curiosity in the other. A figure between worlds, believing, perhaps naively, that reverence alone would be enough. He believed the sacred house would change anthropology. Perhaps it did, but not through publication or lecture, through his absence. In the decades since, no outsider has seen the sacred house again. It remains where it always was, in shadow, protected by those who understand its weight. What does it mean to be invited in, only to never return? And how do we honor the knowledge someone died for when the only witness is gone? The Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years, but it only took a few days to erase Glenn and Bessie Hyde. In November 1928, the newlyweds set off on a homemade scow, determined to raft the entire length of the canyon. Glenn, a seasoned river runner, wanted adventure. Bessie, new to the wilderness, wanted to share in it. They brought with them not just gear, but ambition. If they succeeded, Bessie would be the first woman to raft the entire Grand Canyon. The newspapers were ready. Fame waited downstream. But somewhere along that winding descent, they found something else. On November 18th, the Hyde stopped at Hermit Creek and spoke with a group of travelers. Glenn, animated and intense, told them they'd found something remarkable. Back in one of the side canyons, he said, a place that shouldn't exist. We're documenting everything. Bessie added they had taken photographs and were keeping notes. They planned to share their discovery when the journey was complete. No one pressed for details. No one thought to ask exactly where. That was the last time anyone saw them. On December 1st, their boat was found adrift in calm water, fully intact. Supplies on board. Life vests stowed. No signs of struggle or storm. But Glenn and Bessie were gone. Even more perplexing, the journal and camera they'd shown to others just days earlier were missing. If they had fallen overboard, the raft would have shown signs of chaos, loose supplies, capsized structure. But everything was in place. Everything but them. And so the questions began. Had they gone back to that side canyon to explore further? Had they found a cave, a ruin, a chamber the river had hidden for centuries? The Grand Canyon has long been surrounded by stories of underground cities, ancient tombs, impossible architecture. Most are legends, but legends, like rivers, leave traces. Over the years, hikers and rafters have reported strange stone structures inside canyons. Caves sealed with masonry. Chambers carved deep into cliffs. The Hydes may have found one. They may have entered it, and they may never have left. The canyon gives nothing easily. Its cliffs are walls of silence. Its rapids swallow sound, but the raft, the perfect floating silence of it, refuses to be forgotten. Why was it untouched? Why was the documentation gone? Glenn and Bessie Hyde weren't careless. They had a goal. They were nearly finished. But something pulled them off course. Not the river, but something they believed was more important. Perhaps they thought they had found history. Perhaps they did. We think of explorers as daring, driven, but the Hydes were also in love, newly married, eyes forward, and it's that detail that lingers. Two people chasing wonder and vanishing into it. Some say they got lost, separated, drowned. Others believe they left the raft behind on purpose, walked into the canyon to pursue the mystery further. But no trace was ever found. Not of them, not of the place they described, just an empty boat drifting quietly beneath the cliffs, and a sentence spoken at Hermit Creek that still haunts: "We found something that shouldn't exist." What does it mean when wonder calls and the river answers with silence? The mist never lifts in the cloud forests of northern Peru. It clings to stone and skin alike, as if trying to remember. In 1953, Professor Artemayo Guen led a small team of archaeologists deep into those veiled mountains. Their target, the remnants of the Chacha Poya, a mysterious pre-Incan civilization known for building cities in places no cities should exist, clinging to cliffs, lost in clouds. For 2 weeks, Guen's radio transmissions came in regularly. They had found ruins, stonework, staircases, ceremonial walls. But then, on September 12th, everything changed. "We found it," he said over the static. "The lost city, and something else. A sealed entrance in the cliff face. Geometric. Artificial. We're going to investigate tomorrow." Excitement laced his voice. This wasn't just another ruin. It was a threshold, a door, something intact. The next day, on September 13th, Guen made one final transmission. "We've opened the entrance. It was sealed with stones. Inside there's—" The sentence cut off. Static swallowed the rest. No further messages came. It took 2 weeks for a rescue party to reach their location. When they arrived, the camp was abandoned. Tents stood undisturbed, supplies untouched. But the people, Guen and his 3 team members, were gone. Near the camp, carved into the cliff, they found it. The entrance. A narrow opening, once sealed, now exposed. Stones carefully removed. A passage cut into living rock, too precise to be natural. They followed it 50 meters inside before the tunnel collapsed, choked by fallen stone. They couldn't go further. No bodies, no gear, no sign of panic. Just absence. The official explanation was simple. A collapse had buried the team. But the rescue team noted something strange. The mouth of the tunnel was untouched. No rubble near the entrance. No signs of outward force. If there had been a collapse, it had occurred far inside, quietly. Later attempts to reopen the passage were denied by the Peruvian government. The region was declared off-limits. The cave was sealed. The mountain kept its silence. But what had they seen before the static? Guen's final words hang like a thread in fog. Inside there's, what, art? Tombs? Machines? Nothing? The Chacha Poya believed their ancestors lived in the clouds, beyond death, in chambers of stone and spirit. Perhaps Guen had entered one of those chambers. Perhaps he found not just architecture, but something that resisted being known. The strangest detail wasn't what was found, it was what was left behind. Everything. Tents, notebooks, radios, abandoned in place. As if the entire team had stepped through that doorway, expecting to return, and never did. What lives in the mountains no longer walks among us. But perhaps it waits. Or perhaps it is indifferent, undisturbed for centuries, until a few humans opened its door and were unmade by what lay inside. We think of ruins as passive, stones to be studied. But what if some places are not merely old, but active? What if they don't want to be found? Gwen's last words are a door left ajar. Inside there's... Sometimes the most chilling thing is what you never get to hear. June 1999. The interior of Iceland, a land where fire meets ice, where steam rises from cracks in the earth, and silence reigns beneath stone. Sarah Johansson was a 32-year-old Norwegian geologist with a reputation for precision. She had spent years exploring lava tube systems across Europe, documenting volcanic formations with meticulous care. But on June 23rd, something changed. She radioed her base camp from a remote cave system in the highlands. Her voice, usually measured, was alive with energy. "I found a passage the maps don't show. It goes deeper than it should. The rock is different here, not basalt. There are markings, carved symbols. I'm going to follow it. This could be significant." She agreed to check in every 4 hours. She never called again. A rescue team descended into the cave the next day, following her documented route. Everything was in order. Her markers, her equipment, her notes. About 300 meters in, they found her rope anchored to a rock, but the rope had been cut. Cleanly, not frayed, not snapped. Cut. Beyond that point, there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded gear, no Sarah. The passage continued downward into older rock strata far below where lava tubes typically end. The rescue team reached a narrowing corridor, but were forced to turn back. The cave had become unstable, unsafe. Sarah Johansson was never found. She had described markings, geometric symbols carved into the walls, ancient, deliberate. A few years later, another caver, Erik Thorsen, claimed to have found similar symbols in the same region. He managed to photograph some, but his camera was damaged before he could document them all. He believed the symbols were pre-Viking, perhaps even Bronze Age or older. Thorsen also spoke of a larger chamber beyond the narrow corridor. He couldn't reach it safely. No permits were ever granted to explore it further. Why would Sarah cut her own rope? It made no sense. She was experienced, careful. She would never sever her only link to the surface without reason. Was she trying to keep something or someone else from following? Or was it not her who cut it? The Icelandic highlands are desolate. No one else was known to be near the site. The surrounding terrain is volcanic desert, broken only by steam vents and silence. The simplest explanation is a fall, or a collapse, or disorientation in the darkness, but that cut rope remains. A single, deliberate act in a place built by nature, but perhaps shaped by something more. What did she find? Her last words were not panicked. They were curious, focused. This could be significant. In science, significance means a deviation, something that doesn't fit the model, an anomaly, but in human terms, it can mean a turning point. Perhaps she reached it, and whatever lay beyond the symbols and stone was not meant to return. In caves, sound doesn't echo the way it does above ground. It gets absorbed, swallowed, as if the earth itself is listening. Sarah's voice was the last to speak into that silence. What ancient hands carved those symbols? And what waits in the dark, behind stone, behind time? Sometimes the past doesn't sleep. It waits for someone to find the door and walk through it. October 2004. The forests of North Carolina were damp with the scent of pine and history. Dr. Marcus Webb was a historian obsessed with one of America's oldest mysteries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony in the late 1500s. Over 100 settlers vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the cryptic word Croatoan carved into wood. For centuries, scholars debated what happened. Disease? Attack? Assimilation? Webb had a different theory. He had spent years poring through colonial records, indigenous oral histories, and early cartography. He believed the colonists hadn't vanished. They had moved, guided inland by clues left on marked trees. And in October 2004, he thought he had found the path. He assembled a small team, another historian, an archaeologist, and a documentary filmmaker. They headed into the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, a sprawl of swampland and forest not far from Roanoke Island. On October 19th, Webb left a voicemail for a colleague. "We found it. We found where they went. There's a marked tree, symbols matching John White's description. It leads to a site inland. We're heading there tomorrow. This solves the mystery." He never called again. 4 days later, their rental car was found at a trailhead. Inside was nearly everything: tents, food, clothes, laptops, everything except their cameras, research notes, and field journals. The team had vanished. No bodies, no tracks, no sign of struggle. The forest had closed behind them. Search teams combed the area. The refuge was vast, 150,000 acres of tangled undergrowth and slow-moving water. But trained dogs found no scent trail. Helicopters spotted no camps. Not even a broken branch suggested where they had gone. The mystery deepened. Why would they leave all their supplies behind, except for the documentation of what they had found? Webb had withdrawn a large sum of cash before the trip. He hadn't shared the coordinates of the final site, not even with university officials. His research notes at his office were filled with cryptic symbols and partial coordinates. They referenced the inland place, the marked trail, the second Croatoan. And then nothing. The parallels were chilling. In 1587, the colonists disappeared after carving a message. In 2004, Webb's team followed that trail and also disappeared. What did they find? A burial site? A hidden structure? An undiscovered settlement preserved in swamp and shadow? Or did they awaken something buried not just in soil, but in memory? There are stories, quiet ones, of ancient places deep in the Carolinas, places the tribes did not speak of, places where time moves differently or not at all. And always the forest returns, soft, green, forgetful. The trail of the Roanoke colonists was cold for 400 years. Webb believed he had reignited it, that he was on the verge of solving the oldest disappearance in American history. Instead, he became part of it. A century collapses into a single, echoing silence. The word carved into wood becomes prophecy. Croatoan, then nothing. What is it we pursue when we follow lost stories? Is it truth, or is it the same pull that drew those first settlers into the trees, never to be seen again? Perhaps the past cannot be solved, only joined. August 1989. The Siberian wilderness stretched like a forgotten language, vast, frozen, and silent. Anatoli Mosvven was no stranger to isolation. A Soviet geologist with decades of field work behind him, he was used to working alone in the most remote corners of the earth. That August, he was surveying mineral deposits in the Far East, regions so untouched that maps still bore blank spaces. On August 3rd, his radio check-in began like all the others. Routine, calm. Then a shift in tone. "My equipment is picking up something strange," he said. "Metallic readings, too regular, not natural formations. I see an entrance, artificial, very old, half buried. I'm going in to document." It was the last clear message. 6 hours later, another transmission came through. Garbled, frantic. "Don't send anyone. Tell them." Then static. Then silence. When the rescue team arrived 3 days later, they found his camp intact. His tent, his tools, his instruments still registering those strange anomalies. But no Anatoli. Inside the tent, his journal lay open. On the final page, sketches of geometric symbols, unfamiliar shapes carved into stone, precise, intentional. Beneath them, he had scrawled, "Entrance confirmed, symbols on the wall, not geological, not natural, going in." About half a kilometer away, the team found a section of disturbed earth near a cliff face. Rocks scattered, a narrow gap between boulders, but no entrance now. If one had existed, it had collapsed, or it had closed. No sign of Mosvven, no blood, no trail, just a mouth sealed by time. The official story said accident, landslide, fall, tragedy in the wilderness, but those who worked with him told a different story. Local Evenki tribes called the area the place of the old doors. They warned their children not to go near it. Legends spoke of ancient entrances sealed by their ancestors, places where the underground whispered and the winds changed tone. Mosvven had laughed off the tales. He was a man of science, yet his journal told a different truth. One colleague, years later, claimed the government had recovered a damaged camera from the site, one Mosvven had been using, but the film was never developed. Or if it was, it vanished. Another colleague remembered something even stranger. Mosvven had told him in private that he believed some mineral anomalies might be the remnants of ancient machines, structures buried so deep they had become part of the earth itself. No one believed him until he didn't come back. And still the readings from his instruments remained. Not magnetic, not seismic, something else. The wilderness is good at hiding things, especially those that were hidden long before humans arrived. What did Mosvven see in that valley? And why, at the edge of revelation, was his final message a warning? Don't send anyone. Perhaps some discoveries are not meant to be retrieved. Perhaps some doors, once glimpsed, demand to be left unopened. We speak of the earth as solid, but in places like Siberia, it feels hollow, as if beneath the rock something listens and waits. July 1972. The highlands of Papua New Guinea shimmered with mist and myth. Dr. Emily Brennan was an Australian anthropologist known for her respectful approach to first contact. She wasn't interested in spectacle or headlines, only understanding. That summer, she led a small team deep into a region untouched by outsiders, a place where tribal memory stretched far beyond the written word. For weeks, the expedition built trust with a highland tribe previously unknown to Western anthropology. Brennan's radio updates were filled with quiet amazement, rituals, oral traditions, ancient customs. Then, on July 12th, a new tone crept into her voice. "We've been accepted," she said. "They're taking us tomorrow to a sacred site. They call it the stone place where the old ones sleep. No outsider has ever been allowed there. We'll document everything." The next day, the radio crackled to life. Screaming, chaos, sounds of running, crashing, confusion. Then a single voice, calm but strained. "They're awake." And silence. It took 2 days for helicopters to reach the site. The weather was rough, the terrain rougher. When they arrived, the camp was still there, but empty. Tents stood, supplies were laid out, food half-eaten, as if everyone had stepped out for a moment. They never returned. The tribal village nearby was also deserted. Hundreds of people, gone, cooking fires cold, homes abandoned. Not a single footprint led away. The search teams combed the area for weeks. No bodies, no trails, no clues. The jungle, so dense it hummed, had absorbed everything. The official explanation was cautious. Landslide, disease, mass flight. But nothing fit. No evidence of natural disaster. No signs of violence. And then there was Brennan's final message. They're awake. What had they disturbed? According to tribal stories recorded before the disappearance, the stone place was not merely ceremonial. It was a resting site, a sealed place. The old ones, they said, were not spirits, but ancestors from a time before memory. Builders of stone, sleepers in the mountain, left undisturbed for generations. No one from neighboring tribes claimed to know more. Some even denied the area existed at all. But Brennan believed something was there, perhaps a burial complex, or a city preserved in jungle time, a link to a civilization forgotten before ours began, and maybe she found it. But then, what does it mean to awaken something that has been sleeping longer than history? Not necessarily something monstrous, but something ancient, something bound by rules we no longer remember. Anthropology often draws lines between observer and observed, past and present, sacred and scientific. But sometimes those lines blur. Sometimes you step into a space where the past isn't past at all. Dr. Brennan believed in listening. She had earned the tribe's trust. She believed the journey to the stone place was an honor. Perhaps it was. Perhaps they were not taken, but accepted. But the fact remains, over 300 people disappeared in a single day. A modern expedition, an entire village. And the last words left behind, they're awake. Not we're in danger, not help, just that. A sentence meant not as a cry, but as a revelation. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, and some awakenings aren't meant to be interrupted. November 2002. Antarctica stretched in all directions, white, wind-scoured, and impossibly still. Dr. James Martinez, a glaciologist with the University of Colorado, was stationed alone in the Transantarctic Mountains. His task was routine: study ice layers, collect core samples, and contribute to climate research. He had done this many times before, but this time the ice spoke differently. On November 14th, Martinez sent an encrypted email to a colleague. Found something impossible. There's a structure under the ice. Artificial, geometric, definitely not natural. I'm taking samples tomorrow. If this is what I think it is, it changes everything. He was scheduled for helicopter pickup on November 16th. When the chopper arrived, the camp was untouched. His tent stood, supplies were orderly. His laptop was open, email still glowing on the screen. But Martinez was gone. So were his field notebooks, his ice core samples, his camera. The snow showed no struggle, no tracks beyond his own. The only clue lay half a kilometer from camp, a site where drilling had recently occurred. Small boreholes, ice shavings. And then something strange. Someone had refilled the holes and carefully smoothed the surface. That's not standard protocol. Scientists leave drill sites marked, not concealed. Whatever Martinez had sampled, he didn't want it found. The search team scoured the area. No signs of accident, no crevasses nearby, no equipment trail, no footprints leading away. Satellite images later showed that the drill site Martinez had chosen corresponded to a zone of anomalous radar reflections. Places where ground-penetrating radar had bounced strangely, as if striking hollow or metallic shapes beneath the ice. These had been flagged in previous surveys, but ignored. Martinez, it seemed, had not ignored them. One researcher, years later, said he remembered Martinez talking about the shape beneath, a term he never explained. He'd joked once that the ice might be hiding architecture. After Martinez vanished, no formal excavation followed. The site was too remote, the funding too thin, the justification too murky. But something curious happened. In early 2003, new satellite images showed that the site had been revisited. Fresh boreholes, more drilling, again refilled and smoothed. No official team had reported visiting. Someone had gone back, quietly. Martinez's colleague, the one who received his final email, tried to push for an investigation. He was met with silence. A few years later, he left academia. The only artifact of Martinez's discovery is that final message. There's a structure under the ice. We imagine Antarctica as barren, but beneath its miles of frozen time lies a world unseen. Lakes sealed for millions of years. Mountains higher than the Alps. And maybe, just maybe, something older than us. Something not shaped by ice, but entombed by it. Martinez didn't sound afraid. He sounded awed. If he found something, truly found it, he may have entered a place that was never meant to be reopened. Or he may have been silenced before he could return. Sometimes it's not the how that unsettles us. It's the why. Why smooth the snow? Why erase the evidence? And why does every trace vanish except the one line he left behind? If this is what I think it is, it changes everything. Maybe it already has. Some discoveries begin with a whisper. This one began with a hum. Colonel Percy Fawcett, Everett Ruess, Michael Rockefeller, they all vanished after claiming to find something. But it was the pattern that haunted researchers. It wasn't just that these explorers disappeared. It was what surrounded the disappearances. Final messages filled with excitement, claims of sacred sites, ancient structures, impossible artifacts. Then, nothing. In case after case, the same questions emerged. Why were journals, cameras, and samples missing? Why did seasoned professionals abandon camps without chaos or struggle? Why was the last thing they shared not fear, but awe? And then, just as mysteriously, the silence was followed by erasure. Michael Rockefeller's journal vanished. Sarah Johansson's rope was cut. Marcus Webb's entire team, along with their footage, dissolved into swamp and air. These weren't random misfortunes. These were moments interrupted at the edge of revelation. There's a word for this, though it's rarely spoken aloud in academia. Pattern. A pattern that suggests some discoveries come at a cost. Some see conspiracies, hidden forces, secret groups, but the truth may be simpler and far more unsettling. What if these explorers found things that resisted being known? Not because they were dangerous, but because they were old, unreasonably old, older than culture, language, or history itself. Old enough that remembering them disrupts the stories we tell about who we are. Every civilization draws a line between myth and memory. These disappearances trace that line like a finger in dust. But the silence that follows is not blankness. It is resistance. As if some truths can be approached but never held, like light bending at the edge of a black hole. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not what was found, but what was lost, again and again, with each disappearance. There are patterns in the rock, patterns in the trees, patterns in how the world hides its deeper layers. A geologist hears a strange reading. A historian deciphers a symbol. An anthropologist receives an invitation. And each time, the result is the same. Not a body, not a grave, just a gap. A space where knowledge almost emerged, and then fell silent. We look for conclusions, for the final word. But maybe these stories aren't meant to conclude. Maybe they're meant to echo. To remind us that the unknown isn't always waiting to be conquered. Sometimes it watches, listens, waits, for the right moment to remind us of its presence. In the gaps between pages, in the pauses between words, in the final breath before the signal dies. 10 explorers stood at the threshold. 10 vanished. But what remains is not absence. It is possibility. And perhaps the real question is this: what kind of knowledge leaves only silence in its wake? There's a kind of stillness that follows vanishing. A stillness not of peace, but of unfinished thought. Across 10 stories, we've traced the lives of explorers who didn't merely disappear. They dissolved at the moment of contact. Each stood at the cusp of a discovery. Each spoke, wrote, or signaled something just before the line went dead. They weren't reckless. They were thoughtful, often brilliant. Some were scientists, others seekers. But all of them were pulled towards something just beyond the visible. They reached for it. And then they were gone. No evidence. No conclusion. just a lingering sense that they had seen something real, something ancient, unsettling, or impossibly beautiful, and that seeing it was enough to erase them from the map. Why? Perhaps it's not that they were taken, but that their discoveries could not be carried back. Like light that can only be seen from a distance, some truths may not survive contact with the wider world. Some knowledge cannot be translated into paper or pixels. It can only be witnessed, and then it vanishes with the witness. And so we are left with fragments, a journal page, a final email, a rope, cut clean, a word carved into stone, Nemo. None of these were meant to be endings. They were beginnings, threads waiting to be followed. But they end in silence. And maybe that's the point. We imagine exploration as conquest. We draw lines across maps. We place flags. We name mountains. But these stories remind us that exploration is also surrender, to uncertainty, to humility, to wonder. Because wonder, real wonder, is not safe. It does not resolve. It opens. What if some truths exist not to be known, but to be pursued? What if the role of the explorer is not to return with answers, but to remind us that questions still remain? In every century, in every culture, there are those who vanish, not into failure, but into mystery, into places where the rules falter and where meaning refuses to be simplified. We call them lost, but perhaps they are simply elsewhere, held in a different kind of memory, one not recorded in books or data, but in the human longing to understand what lies just beyond reach. And maybe that longing is the oldest truth of all, that in the vastness of the world, not everything can be mapped. Not every voice is meant to echo. Not every path leads home. Some paths lead inward, into the stone, into the forest, into the silence that waits behind discovery. And in that silence, something remains. Not absence, not tragedy, but the possibility that the world is still larger than we know, still full of places that resist being found, still full of stories waiting for the next voice brave enough to say, "I found something," and then step forward one last time into the unknown. They found something. That's what ties them together, not just their disappearances, but the moment before, the discovery, the message, the breath before the silence. A city in the jungle, symbols in the desert, a sacred house in the forest, a geometric shape beneath the ice. Each story begins with a boundary between what we know and what we sense exists just beyond. And in every case, someone crossed it, not recklessly, but with purpose, with reverence. Then, the pattern, a journal left behind but missing its final pages, a voice interrupted mid-sentence, a tent untouched, equipment neatly packed waiting for someone who never returned. The world, it seems, has places it does not wish to reveal easily. But it also has people who keep asking. Explorers aren't just adventurers. They're reminders that there are still thresholds worth crossing, still questions worth asking, even if the answers remain just out of reach. We want conclusions, but these stories offer something deeper, a glimpse of how little we truly know. The terrain may change, jungle, canyon, ice, stone, but the tension remains. Between knowing and not knowing, between presence and absence, between the map and what waits beyond its edge. There are lessons here, if we're willing to hear them. That discovery is fragile, that not all knowledge can be carried home, that wonder, real wonder, resists containment. In a world rushing toward certainty, these explorers moved in the opposite direction, toward mystery, toward the untouched, toward whatever waits in the places no one goes. And maybe that's what keeps these stories alive, not just the loss, but the longing they leave behind. A sense that something remains out there, not hidden maliciously, but hidden patiently, waiting for the right moment, the right question, the right person, or maybe just waiting to be remembered, so we remember them. Not for the answers they didn't bring back, but for the doors they showed us. For the idea that the world is still vast, still strange, still full of rooms we haven't entered and names we haven't spoken. They found something, and maybe that's enough. To know the edge is there, to know we are not finished knowing, to feel the pull of the unknown, and to step forward anyway. That is the human story, and it's still being written.